Perfect. Okay. Now I work on social norms, on various aspects of social norms. So naturally, I have been very curious and interested in a new branch of social policy called nudging. Do you hear me well? It's fine. Called nudging. And now nudging was introduced by a famous book by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein in 2008. And the idea, the interesting idea, is that as opposed to incentive, to monetary incentive, positive or negative, so rewards or punishment, nudges are much cheaper because they reframe the choice architecture to direct behavior in hopefully better directions, but without limiting the possible options that agents have, or, as I said, not acting on economic incentives. Now, the most important examples of nudging have been basically works that lead the individual to behave in a better way, health-wise, for example. One famous example has been the Encourage Trail, in which there's a big problem with medication adherence. You know, people, especially people with diabetes or people with HIV, that have to constantly take medication. Well, people often do not take their medication or forget to take medication or stop taking medications. And so it is very important to induce them. And the Encourage trial was apparently quite successful in nudging people again to take their medication. Another important work was done with pensions, because I don't know if you know, but very few people save for retirement in the US. And the US is a place where basically you do your saving, because pensions have been almost everywhere abolished. So you have to save. And the kind of place where you save is called 401k. And so the problem was, how do we induce people to save more and to protect themselves for old age? And again, the trick was to do automatic enrollment. So people were really, you know, a little sluggish. We don't want to change things. And so it was a very successful program. Now, all these nudging techniques, programs, etc., were aimed at inducing behavior that benefits the performer. Okay? While there are lots of other behaviors that instead not only may benefit probably also the performer, but benefits society, benefits the collective. And here is norm nudging who was born. So what do you do when you believe that behavior is not completely independent, but there is interdependence of behavior? Okay, you nudge, again, you use nudging, so the soft push, if you will, with information about what other people do, or, and sometime you join the two information, what other people approve of or disapprove of. Okay, and the idea is this social information will induce better collective behavior, will change behavior. Okay. Now, how do these nudges work? What is the mechanism? Well, the mechanism is what we call social comparison. Okay, for example, famous example, Holsworth in England joined, government office to alert taxpayers that the majority pays on time. And this had apparently an effect on how many more people pay their taxes on time. Another great example is Bogota, Colombia, when Antanas Mocos was the mayor there. He basically hired mimes that went around in traffic. Traffic was terrible. There were a lot of deaths, so they wanted to curb that. And they were giving thumb up, green card, thumb down, red card to people. And since you could see other people with a green or a red card, everybody wanted a green card. And therefore, a lot of people, started driving in a much better way, okay? So again, social comparison is the key, because you watch other people, you see what other people do, or you're told what other people do, and you sort of feel you want to do like them. Now, what is the necessary assumption behind this effect? Is that behaviors are interdependent, okay? Why my taking medicine on time every day is independent of what other people do? Typically, my paying taxes, my driving fast or slow, etc., are all things that are behavior that are interdependent. What do I mean technically by saying interdependent? I mean that the preference for performing, in this case, the target behavior, the behavior we want to change, to ameliorate, are conditional on people's social expectations. And I come to that in a second. So my definition of a norm nudge is important to keep in mind, is a nudge whose mechanism of action is based on eliciting social expectation. So you sort of create this expectation in people with the goal of inducing desirable behavior, in particular, socially desirable behavior, under which assumption, crucial, the assumption that people's preference for performing that target behavior are conditional on their social expectation. So the idea is that we feed people expectation, we change their belief, expectation and beliefs, obviously, we change their beliefs in order to change behavior. Now, question, okay, social expectation, should we change or induce a new? Well, there are two types that are fundamental. One is empirical, what other people do, and the other is normative, what other people approve, disapprove of, think one should not do. So to be effective, norm nudging requires several things. First, we have to identify the mechanism through which different types of information affect behavior. So you give empirical messages, okay, how does it affect behavior? When it is successful or unsuccessful, do you know why? Do you know the mechanism through which this input, which is the message, produces a certain output? And the problem with norm nudging is that it has always been a black box. And the work myself and my colleagues are trying to do is just opening this black box, okay? Opening the black box also implies that we understand what motivates specific behavior. Because when you want to change behavior, you have to understand more or less why people do what they do, okay? For example, think of littering. That's a great example because very often, it is believed that people litter out of convenience, why there is no garbage can around. Therefore, they litter. What else can they do? And in Philadelphia, there has been a sort of campaign in certain very dirty and poor neighborhoods, to ameliorate the state of the neighborhood. And so the first idea is, well, people litter because, they don't have garbage cans, etc. And so a lot of garbage cans were transported into this neighborhood, and littering was not better. Why? Because in that case, littering again is a social, in inverted comma, activities. You see other people litter and you think, okay, you know, everybody does that. Shouldn't I do it? Of course, yes. Also, the fact that everybody does, we will look at it later on, tells me that people approve of that. It's okay to do that, so I will do that. So there is a social motivation here, and if you don't take into account the social motivation, if you don't understand it, you may do intervention that do not work. Another important issue is, well, we should understand the context in which this behavior occurs. And I'm coming to that later on. Now, when I say, okay, we have to understand, you know, how people are motivated to do A versus B, what sort of question is the relevant one here behind this very generic question, what motivates people? Well, the question is, are their behavior independent? Like, you know, I take my medicine at a certain time every day. You know, I don't care what other people do. This is, you know, my behavior for myself, versus interdependent. Well, when I pay taxes, my decision to pay taxes may be interdependent because I may pay attention to the information that maybe other people don't pay taxes in time, or maybe a lot of people don't pay taxes at all, and so on and so forth. So we have, when we look at motivation, we have to understand whether behavior is independent or interdependent. Now, how do we know that? Well, here comes the field of measurement. Only by measuring certain type of units, in this particular cases, beliefs, reference network, and preferences, only measuring these three things, you will be able to decide whether behavior is independent or interdependent. If it is interdependent, it's a very good idea to do not nudging. If it is independent, it will work. Now let's look at each of these elements. And again, all our works in my group at our Center for Social Norm and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania, we do mostly work in measurement. So what do we measure? First, social expectation. First, first you can measure behavior. Sometimes you know what people do, you have the statistics. Sometimes you don't know exactly what they do, especially it's very private behavior. So you usually also measure personal behavior. But the important thing, you have to measure what these people believe that other people do in a similar situation. Okay, these are what I call empirical expectation. You also want to measure normative expectation. What a person believes, other believes, is a second order belief that one should do in a similar situation. And this matters for a lot of people, as we shall see. Now, when I say other people, I have to be very specific. In fact, I have to be able to measure, to define what we call the reference network. The people whose behavior and belief matter to the agent. So when I drive in Philadelphia, my reference network is other drivers, people who cross the street, people who bicycle, buses, etc. This is my reference network. They matter to me. When, let's say, I teach as a professor, my reference network are my students, my colleagues, personnel at the university, and so on and so forth. So different situations have very different reference network, and we have to be able to measure them, to understand where to act. And why? Because our social beliefs are related to specific reference networks. Okay. Now, we have to unearth networks. We have to know what are we talking about? Okay. And in order to tailor surveys, we use a lot of surveys to understand what motivates people to behave one way or another, and in particular to understand if this behavior is independent or interdependent, when we always measure at the same time the network related to this target behavior. Okay. Also, we have to study how information is transmitted through a network, because the faster it goes, the better it is for intervention. If there are bottlenecks, if there are transmission problems, it's going to be a problem to induce, relatively fast collective behavior. And in particular, there is something that we have to keep in mind. Sometimes we do an intervention in a community and it's very successful. And then a normal procedure is, well, let's do this intervention in other communities. It's perfectly reasonable, prima facie, but very unreasonable, we see in reality, because we have to check if the relevant networks in these different communities are similar or not. If they are not, okay, an intervention that worked very well in situation A will be a total failure in situation B. So measuring networks is very important. We can then discuss how it is done. Last but not least, so we measure social expectation, we measure networks. Then we want to know if people preference depend on this expectation. All our work is grounded on that. And so the big question is that, do expectations have causal relevance? Okay, do they induce certain behaviors? If they change, will behavior change? Okay, this is a crucial question for non-nudging, because you want to change expectation in order to change behavior. So you have to be sure that people have conditional preferences. Now we are in trouble. And also we want to know if some expectations are more important than others. So for example, inducing empirical expectation, beliefs about what other people do, what other people are expected to do, is more important than inducing expectation about what people approve or disapprove of. And in my research, the answer is yes, they are more important. Now, to conclude, if preference for a certain type of behavior, for target behavior in this case, are conditional on social expectation, so norm nudging will be successful because changing expectation will indeed change behavior. Okay. Now, when I talk of motivation, I talk of two big classes of behavior: independent and interdependent. Independent behavior, I define them as behavior that are grounded on unconditional social preference. Okay, so what motivates me to behave is not dependent on what I know, I believe, I see other people do, nor what I think they approve or disapprove of. And the typical example I give is using umbrella when it rains. I do it independently of what other people do if I don't want to get wet, okay? Or refusing to harm an innocent person. Other people do, other people approve of that, I don't care, I'm not going to do it. So these are typically independent behavior. Interdependent behavior are most behavior actually we perform are interdependent, where preference, social preference are conditional. Why? For example, fashion. When you follow fashion, you are imitating somebody else. So your expectations about the behavior, in this case, the dressing behavior of somebody else, play a crucial role in coloring your decision to buy certain clothes or not. Fads, the same. Rules of etiquette, important. Convention, like traffic convention, linguistic convention, very important. What other, which signals, in a sense, other people obey to, other people adopt, are very important for your adoption. And of course, then we go to the realm of social norms, and social norms basically are the more complex of these rules, because in a social norm, you have both normative and empirical expectations, and preference are conditional on both. Think of fairness rule. It matters to you whether other people behave in a fair way or not in a particular situation, but it also usually matters to you whether people approve of other people being fair in that particular situation. So I divide behavior, this sort of coarse division, but it's very important when you try to open the black box. And to the left are all the independent behavior, and can be completely descriptive, like customs, okay? Or injunctive, like moral rules, telling you exactly what to do and when to do it. And in both cases, the preference for the behavior is not socially conditional. Expectation, you can have all sorts of expectation, but they will not matter. You have to realize that when you do intervention, because this kind of intervention on a custom and on moral behavior is very different from norm nudging. Norm nudging goes to the right column, where we have interdependent behavior, i.e. preference are socially conditioned. For a descriptive norm, only empirical expectation do matter. For a social norm, you need both empirical and normative. And I want you to realize why for a social norm, you need also normative expectation. Why? Because the social norm is there because there is very often a tension between selfish behavior, I want basically to ameliorate my own situation. I want to do something that doesn't cost anything to me, okay? Versus collective benefits. In many cases, paying taxes, if I think, well, everybody pays taxes, okay? So my empirical expectation, everybody does, let's say, but I may have a temptation there. Well, if I am not observed, if people don't find me out, maybe I don't pay, okay? So I benefit myself to versus damaging the community. And I may think the damage is very small, almost imperceptible, but still, exactly we need social norm for all these situations in which what the individual wants to do, the welfare, if you think of the individual, is pitted against the welfare of the community. And that's why we need also this normative element to keep us on track in some sense. And here I show you basically how the different type of nudging, how do they work? So when you observe a pattern of behavior and we do some measurement, okay, and we decide to the left that these behavior are independent, so people follow no matter what, then simple nudges may work. We have custom, we have moral norm. Think of nudges that remind you about what the right thing to do, the good thing to do is. You might not think about that, but a nudge that reminds you of that may be very effective. On the right side, instead, we have interdependent behavior. This behavior basically are followed because what other people do, descriptive norm of what other people do and approve of, social norm. And norm nudging is extremely effective only, in desire, descriptive or social norms. Now, do we need different intervention for a descriptive versus a social norm? Think of traffic rules. Well, traffic rules are typical descriptive norm in the state convention, okay? empirical expectations are all that matters and are neutral and interdependent. And so to change these rules, you need basically to train people to drive in a different way and to train people to expect other people to drive, in this case, to the right side of the road. That's what happened in Sweden, very famous, change of driving rules. And, it was very well coordinated, and soon enough, people started driving to the right side instead of the left side of the road. So you need to coordinate, you need to send messages about what other people do, but this is all you need. Instead, cleaning after your dog is not so much descriptive norm as a social norm. Why? Because people may have the tendency, it's costly not to do that if nobody observes you, or if you are in a community where you see that very few people do that, etc., etc. And so it's very interesting that in order to behavior, there must be a descriptive component, that you have to be sure that most people do this in your neighborhood, let's say, but also a normative component. You may be really uneasy to be seen not doing that. So the type of intervention will be very different for these different type of activities that do not or do involve also a normative component. Now, the big question with social norms is a big question mark I put down there when we do norm nudging, is how we can change or induce different social expectation in people. So for a social norm, it's both normative and empirical. For a descriptive norm, you only need empirical. But the big question is, how do you do that? How does norm nudging work? Okay. Now, very often, a lot of norm nudging has used empirical information. So information about what other people do. And the results are mixed. There are cases in which work, for example, in California, they compare electricity consumption to the consumption of your neighbors, and these reduce consumption. Or a very famous case is you tell hotel guests that most other guests reuse towels. And we will go back to this example, it's very interesting. And in the best possible case of this experiment, more guests reuse towels, so they respond to this message. The big problem with the successful intervention is that the effects are usually short-lived. So, people behave well for a while, but then they go back to the old behavior. Not always, but this is a very important element when you think of, doing or nudging, how to do it, etc. What we need really are longitudinal studies that will tell us if the intervention failed and try to understand why it failed. Now, it can also fail immediately. You don't need a longitudinal study. Why? For two reasons, language and context. Language, there is a very famous Schulz and colleague examples. They compare electricity use to the electricity use of your neighbors, but the language they use is, they say, the average electricity consumption is. Now, what happened if you tell the average electricity consumption is that people were below the average increased their consumption, and people who were above average decreased, but not that much. So the issue is you leave the situation basically unchanged, if not worse. So pay attention to the language you use. The second is the context matters. So the famous Goldstein experiment he did in 2008 on, basically reusing the hotel towels. was replicated in Europe, in Austria and some other place, and it didn't work at all. If anything, it backfired. More people threw their towels on the floor. And there are several hypotheses why it backfires, but to me, the interesting thing is, well, in a very different context, Europe is very different from the US. This experiment did not work. So what was peculiar in the US concept that made it work? Now, what are the reasons why this intervention on empirical expectations, descriptive behavioral intervention, don't work? Now, one important reason is you misunderstand the reference network, or you are ambiguous about the reference network. For example, in research I did for UNICEF about child nutrition in sub-Saharan Africa, the typical type of intervention is, let's give young mothers information about the benefit of giving colostrum, first milk, to the newborn. And the problem is that the reference network for making a decision is not other young mothers, is the mother-in-law. She's the big decision makers. And so not knowing this, all these interventions were failures, because the young lady, even if she was convinced, she would obey the mother-in-law. That is the rule. Okay, so this is an obvious, simple example how a mistake in identifying the reference network, was really deadly because spend money in information and nothing happens. Another thing is specifying the network is important to avoid what we call self-serving interpretation. And we know that from Goldstein's example of recycling, reusing the towels in a hotel. They had 3 cases. One is information, very generic reference network. People in US hotels, many people do reuse their towels. The second was less generic. Many people in this particular hotel reuse their towels. And the third, my students call it creepy, said the previous resident in room 351, where you are, reused their towels. Now, can you imagine which one had the most effect? The third, when the reference network is people in my room did that. Which was most ineffective? The first. Why? Why do I say self-serving interpretation? Because I may think, okay, maybe people in cheaper hotels reuse their towels, but this is a nice hotel, and why should people reuse their towels? So they think this is really not my reference network. I am in a much nicer hotel. Only people in low level, motels and so on do that. I won't do that. So it's very important to be very clear about the reference network. And a very good example is an example of what Housework did in England. They discovered that a lot of general practitioners were overprescribing antibiotics to people. And so what they did, they sent messages informing the overprescribing doctors that 80% or more of other doctors in their area, very important, okay, prescribed less. This had an effect, but the very crucial thing is the reference network in their area. Okay, so if I am in London and you tell me that in Scotland, in St. Andrews, doctor prescribe less, I may think, well, the air is cleaner there, of course. So it's very important that the people you are comparing yourself with are in a situation very, very similar, if not the same, to yours. Okay, same story with COVID-19 messages. Early messages were very generic, actually quite wrong. I remember in Italy, they were telling, that mostly older and sick people and people with low immunity, get really sick. And so young and healthy people said, that's not me. I'm not doing anything. Okay, so it was really a wrong signal, a wrong message, a wrong reference network. Okay. Another reason why messages may fail is they may not be trusted or credible. And we did, if we have time, I can show it. I did an experiment on 9 different countries, a huge experiment on COVID-19 rules. And you see that even if not nudging can be successful in the sense that you convince people of what other people are doing, that other people are doing the right thing and approve of the right thing, adopting these anti-COVID rules, if there is no trust in science, so in the message that is sent, it is a scientific message, not nudging will be ineffective. Last but not least, psychologists know that if you receive information that is inconsistent with your beliefs, you will reject it, because we are all, prey to what we call a confirmation bias. You look at information and confirm what you already believe, not at falsifying information. Now, so these are all the problem that we may encounter when we do nudging with descriptive information. What about normative information? Now, it is still very unclear how effective normative information alone is. So Brent, for example, had a study in which they give normative information for water conservation. So it's good to blah, blah, blah. And apparently they were effective, but again, we know they don't last longer. Effect doesn't last longer. Cialdini has a famous example in which he says, yeah, positive normative message outweighed negative evidence, negative descriptive norm about littering. And Schultz and especially Sion Banot show that adding normative information to empirical information, so it's a more social norm type of message, about electricity usage was much more effective than pure descriptive information. Okay. Problem. Very often we are in a situation where the descriptive is bad. Let's say, we know and expect a lot of corruption. A lot of countries, corruption is endemic. So the empirical message, the descriptive message is, people are corrupt, but the normative is very different. You should not be corrupt. You should not lie to a public officer, and so on and so forth. So the normative and the empirical are incongruent. And what we know, I did with EarthXL in 2009, it was probably the first experiment in which we measure, how different the responses are when empirical and normative go in different directions. And what we show is that the empirical wins. So unfortunately, a lot of corruption campaigns say, how that we have to fight corruption because they are telling us how common corruption is, and they use normative messages. Do you think they are successful? No, they are not. We have a lot of evidence about failures of these messages, okay? Also, a normative message in the form, not so much of normative expectation, but a pure normative message saying the right thing to do is, very often normative messages have this form. What is the signal they send to people? If you have to tell me, or I tell you, guys, the good thing to do is to do X, Y, Z, how do you interpret it? What do you infer from it? That most people don't do it. Otherwise, you wouldn't waste your time telling me what's the right thing to do. And so this message is very ambiguous because it tells us what is right to do, but behind that, we think that's why you have to send me the message, because people don't do the right thing, unfortunately. And so it has a counterproductive effect. So the judgment is very mixed about the normative information effectiveness. Now, norm nudging, so summarizing all these things, can backfire seriously. Why? Information is ambiguous, like the hotel story. Poor hotel, rich hotel, who knows, etc. I interpret it in a way that allows me to keep misbehaving, in inverted commas. So ambiguous information may allow what we call the moral wiggle room. Okay. Also, as I gave you the example of corruption, mentioning that many people engage in a bad behavior normalizes it. Oh, everybody does it. They may do it. It's okay. Okay, at least it's acceptable. And this is the scourge of collective, anti-corruption campaigns. Typically, they do this mistake. And also, and this is something that I work on a lot, we get asymmetric inferences from different types of information. This is a study I'm conducting with a student of mine in a variety of behaviors. Basically, what is seen is that has already been studied, that the more common negative behavior is or is presented as being, the more will people infer it is approved, it is okay? On the other hand, disapproval of negative behaviors, so most people disapprove of stealing, etc., does not imply that the good behavior is common, that most people do not steal. This is very, very important, okay? And the second thing, so there is an asymmetry between empirical and normative information and what you infer from them. And last but not least, the example I gave you, when there is conflict between empirical and normative, usually the empirical wins. Also because the inference we draw are much stronger from empirical than normative, okay? And talk about an experiment we did where we started being curious about the inference, and then I move to experimenting with lots of behavior. Basically, in this experiment, we were exploring self-serving beliefs and, of course, behavior, okay? And I show you immediately the experiment, okay? So the experimental design is a slight modification of the die under the cup paradigm. What is this? You have, you toss the die. If 5 come out, you get a prize. Let's say you get $1. If any other face come out, you get nothing, okay? However, I, the experimenter, or the other participant, nobody can tell what you really saw. So the possibility of lying is very, very high, okay? And we did this experiment with a number of people and we got results. And then we start a new experiment with different people, okay? And the participants could be in one or another condition. Either they knew, so they knew tossing the die experiment had been performed. They know what the experiment was. They knew everything. They didn't know how people behaved, but they know the experiment, all of them. But one group is told at the beginning, and by the way, you will do the experiment again yourself. And the other group is said nothing. They don't know that they will have to do the experiment themselves, okay? So there are people who know they will do the experiment, people who don't know to do the experiment. Then we ask them questions about different states of the world, okay? And the questions are the following. So half of the participants are given empirical information half of the participants are given normative information. So I've already groups, those who know they will play the game, do not. Each of these two groups are given two subgroups. One subgroup that is given the normative uncertainty condition, and the other subgroup is empirical uncertainty condition. That's the normative uncertainty. I tell you, please, you know that some people did the experiment before, and you know what the experiment is. Read the following statement and tell me whether you believe, you know, which of them is true. And I have the data from the previous experiment. So if you tell me, if you answer correctly, if you guess correctly, you get a prize. Okay. And you have to decide which is true. In a similar study, most people say it is acceptable to lie for your own benefit, versus in a similar study, most people say it is not acceptable to lie for your own benefit. Can you please tell me, guess which one is true? The people with the empirical uncertainty condition instead, same story, you can guess. If you guess correctly, you get a prize. Please, which one is true? In a similar study, most people lied for their own benefit, or in a similar study, most people did not lie for their own benefit. Okay. And then we look at how people decide. Now, let's look at the top two figures. Now, you see that when in the belief elicitation case, those people that were given the empirical question, but also who knew they can play the game afterwards, okay? They say basically that almost 63% lied. I believe that the majority are, 63% of the people, say, I believe that the majority lied. So those who know they will play the game, you know, are shameless. They say, I believe that the majority lied. Instead, only 47%, so a minority of those who did not know that they would play the game afterward, say, I believe that the majority lied. Their beliefs is that the majority did not lie. So you see here, with empirical belief, that knowing or not knowing that you will play the game afterwards and that you could obviously lie, changes your assessment, changes your beliefs, your empirical expectation, basically. Interestingly enough, for the normative question, those who receive the normative question, there is no difference between those who know they will play the game afterwards and those who do not know. And it's very interesting. There are a lot of debates about this, and we are agnostic as to why, okay, they don't change their normative expectation. But the interesting, our interesting result is, I preview here, they don't change them because they don't need to change them to lie. Okay, and I will show in the second one. Look at behavior. You see that 38.7 or almost 40% of the people who say most people lie, etc., lie. The red line is like 16 and something percent is the expected real number, probabilistically speaking, of fights that should be declared, okay? And so the people who guess that most people lied because, they know they will be able to lie afterwards are the people who lie the most in the game. And interestingly enough, the people who lie the least, and is obviously statistically significant, are those that did not know that they had to play the game. So they find themselves playing the game. They said that most people in their view did not lie. They sort of followed that that assumption that people don't lie. I don't lie. Interestingly enough, normative expectation, behavior, they lie with the same percentages. Okay. And now the question is, how come that the empirical, is so when you have to give a statement about empirical expectations, you are more prone to overstate, okay, the number of people who lie, but normative expectations instead stay the same. Why so? And so we follow up with another experiment, and this experiment is about inferences, okay? And we divide people into groups, and we give empirical information. In the first group, I give you empirical information about what people did, and then I ask you to infer, okay, what they approved of. Did they approve, disapprove, etc. The second group, I start giving normative information, what they approve, and then ask them to infer their behavior, than what they did. And these are the interesting results. So to the left, you see the situation in which we start by telling people, hey, in that game, the majority of people did not lie. Okay, the script did not lie. Now, how many people do you think disapprove of lying? And this violet color is the large majority of people who are believed to disapprove of lying. So if I tell you people do X, empirical, it's a very strong inference to the normative. They do it, and they must approve of it if they do it. The other case is first information we give it, the majority disapprove of lying. Okay, that experiment, the majority disapprove of lying. Then how many people do you think did not lie? And you see it's basically 50-50. So from normative information, people do not infer equally well the empirical. So there is an asymmetry in the inference between normative and empirical. And this led me, with a student of mine, to do more experiments about inferences, because norm nudging, in the end, is successful or not, based on which inference people draw from the information we give them. Okay? And so with a student of mine, Jimmy Kwong, we have done several experiments to test what people infer from information about what other people do versus what other people approve or disapprove of. And what we discover are two things. The inferences vary by the type of social expectation that you elicit. So empirical to normative and normative to empirical, different inferences. However, this effect is modulated by the variance of the behavior. So if the behavior is positive, is one thing. If the behavior is negative, like bribing, etc., or being aggressive or whatever, negative, you get a very different result, a different asymmetry. And of course, we also see that there are different inferences across different behavioral domains. Okay, so what we did, participants were randomly assigned to judge either the approval rate of a certain behavior, the aggregated behavior, among residents in a hypothetical city. I show you in a second the vignette, that receive, they get empirical information regarding how common is this behavior in this hypothetical city, and then tell me how many people do you think approve of this behavior, versus judging the prevalence of the behavior, how frequent is the behavior, after I give you normative information about how much approved it is, how endorsed it is, okay? So the behavior that we look at are 23 behavior. And we randomize the order in which you may receive. You receive 23 different behaviors. And for each behavior, you will be in one of 4 conditions. Descriptive, what they do, positive, they behave well. Descriptive, negative, they misbehave. Normative, positive, they approve of the good behavior. Normative, negative, they, let's say, approve of the bad behavior, okay? And they have to respond, you know, use a slider to indicate the inference they make, okay? And goes from 100%. So 0 means so no one 100%. Everybody does, everybody approves. An example of, for example, speed driving, okay? So we have 4 different conditions. The empirical positive, new city, most resident drive below the speed limit. So they are very good. Please infer how many of these people think it is appropriate to drive below the speed limit. So you give a positive empirical, and they have to do an inference about the normative, which normative attitude do they have. The normative positive, instead I tell in this new city, most residents say it is appropriate to drive below the speed limit. Please tell me, guess, how many residents do you think do in fact drive below the speed limit? Then, so the valence in both initial cases is positive. You know, they behave, they do the right thing. In the last 2 cases, the valence is negative. So in this new city, most residents drive above the speed limit. So there is a speed limit, they don't care. How many do you think say it is appropriate to drive above? And the last group is given the normative negative. In the city, most residents say it is appropriate to drive above the speed limit. Now, how many residents do you think do that, in fact? Okay. So there is positive behavior, negative behavior, so valence, and there is normative information and empirical information. And look what happens. For the positive behavior, which was positive norm, there is very little variance in response. But people have a higher inference rating in the positive condition than in the negative condition across all behavioral domains, okay? For the positive behavior. For the negative behavior, there is much more variance, okay? We'll see why. And again, when we look to the right side, this is the interesting side, okay? And you have positive and negative norm. Now, when the behavior is the inference from a normative is much stronger, the blue point versus the red point, than the inference from normative to empirical, okay? So if I tell you most people pay taxes on time, the inference of most people approve of taxes on time is very strong. If instead I tell people, oh, most people approve paying taxes on time, the inference about they do it is much weaker, okay? So words and deeds are 2 different things. However, when we go to negative behavior, we tip this relation. So if I say most people, don't pay taxes on time, okay? Well, what do they infer? Do you infer that they approve of it? Is weaker than telling them most people approve of not paying taxes on time? Do you think they do it? What they do it? This inference is much stronger from the normative to the empirical. So we have really an asymmetry here. In the positive, empirical dominates normative information insofar as the inference, from empirical to normative or normative to empirical, but with negative behavior is the opposite. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, look at lots of normal behavior. These double asymmetry exist. Taxation, littering, cutting in line, cheating, we have exactly the same. However, there are some outliers. And these outliers are interesting. Bribing is very interesting because we put the question, there are two bribing questions. And one question is bribing university officers to get your kid in, or bribing the public officer to get a contract, let's say. And vaccine, again, is positive. Is, most people, vaccinate versus most people do not vaccinate, and the type of inference. And here, there is one asymmetry, but not the other. And it's not difficult to explain, the context dependence. So this pattern is generally okay for most cases, but there is context dependence in some cases because some behavior fall out of this pattern. And the outliers, we think, we're still experimenting on them, can be explained by the observability of behavior, by how frequent a behavior is. So what the base rate in people's mind of that behavior, and the level of agreement, like vaccination, among respondents. Let's look at one example. Most people believe that it is permissible to bribe to get into college. Okay, so we give them the normative assessment. Most people believe it's okay to bribe. So it's a negative behavior, and we give them the normative. And we know that normally they will infer, strong inference will be strong empirical. Oh, yes, most people do. No, in this case, they don't. Why? Because inferring how common a behavior is also conditional on the base rate of this behavior. In fact, now we're measuring all the base rates. Why? How many people are indeed financially able to bribe for $500,000 or more a college officer? Very, very few. So in this case, respondents think that bribing college officers or government officers is uncommon, right? And therefore, the inference is different from the common inference. Most people agree to do the bad thing, then most people do the bad thing. No, most people don't do the bad thing because, they don't have the money to do that. They may approve, but they can't, okay? And so all those cases where we see that this asymmetry doesn't work are generally cases where the base rate is very low, very low. So to summarize, in general, over 23 behavior, the majority of this behavior, we found a double asymmetry in norm inference. So a positive behavior, empirical information leads to a parallel normative inference, and normative information leads to a much weaker empirical evidence, inference, when we have a positive behavior. So there is asymmetry there, first asymmetry. The second asymmetry is between positive and negative behavior, because normative information about negative behavior leads to a very strong empirical inference, but empirical information about negative behavior doesn't lead with strong normative inference, opposite to what happens with positive behavior. So our evidence supports some work by Erickson and colleagues that associate, that say people mentally associate what is common with what is acceptable. They say moral, I wouldn't use that word, but common with acceptable, okay? So our findings suggest what? That the direction and relative strength of this association is modulated by the valence of the behavior, positive versus negative.